Alright, it's time for an update to one of my favorite open world farming specs, the Deadeye. They often get labeled as a selfish class when it comes to group content, which is actually great if we're talking about the open world. This is probably the most efficient build when it comes to solo farming, and especially if you've been following my solo materials farming series. In my previous guide, I ran a rifle for killing enemies and a short bow for mobility and tagging. Thanks to the recent buff to our pistols, we can now swap out rifle for dual pistols for an even smoother gameplay loop. Before we get to the gear though, let's take a look at our traits and skills first. We're going to be picking up critical strikes, which will massively boost our critical strike chance as well as our critical strike damage. In all of my previous builds, I went with practice tolerance, but since we're wielding dual pistols now, my preference goes towards deadly aim, which will let all of our pistol skills pierce our enemies and is a huge quality of life improvement. The final trait we'll pick up is invigorating precision, which will make healing an afterthought for most of the things you'll be doing when you're playing solo. Our second trait line will entirely depend on you. If you tend to pick up the offensive and defensive Jade protocols every single time you play, then going Deadly Arts will be an incredible buff to your overall damage output. If you don't want to stack the buffs prior to every single gaming session, I would recommend taking Trickery instead. This will ensure you have access to the most important boons at all times. Thrill of the Crime will take care of Fury, Might and Swiftness, and Bountiful Theft will add another 5 stacks of Might and Vigor every time you mark an enemy. Our final trait is Sleight of Hand, which will reduce the cooldown of our steel. This is not as needed when you're fighting regular enemies, but when you mark the wrong target, you'll be grateful for that reduced cooldown. Trickery also increases your initiative and adds a couple of ways to regain your resources faster. This isn't strictly necessary when you're farming regular mobs in the open world, but it sure does come in handy when you're fighting veterans and above, as you'll be able to keep unloading on them at all times. And this brings us to our Deadeye traits, which will do 3 incredibly important things for us. Collateral damage will cause an AoE explosion when our marked target dies, which combined with all of our pistol skills piercing now, will take care of packs of mobs in no time. Payback will reduce our cooldowns by 20% every time our marked target dies. And Be Quick or Be Killed will ensure we have permanent quickness, allowing us to attack our enemies even faster. So without Jade buff protocols, this will mean we will always have 25 stacks of Might, as well as Fury, Swiftness, Vigor and Quickness, which are all essential if you want a smooth gameplay loop. You could even choose to take on champion enemies with this build by simply changing the Deadeye traits, without the need for an extra set of gear. Instead of focusing on cooldown reduction and dealing extra damage when an enemy dies, we'll be focusing on getting all possible buffs and gaining an extra 1% damage for every single boon currently active on us. In the video, you'll also see me swapping out my utility skills every now and then. That's because this build works with almost any of them. There is somewhat of a method to the madness though. There are 3 healing skills I would generally recommend. If you're struggling against conditions, then you wanna go with Withdraw. If you could use an extra source of stealth so that you can use your ambush attack more often, then you wanna go with Hide in Shadows. And if you need neither, then the passive regen from Signet of Malice will always benefit you. The first utility is all about doing things faster or doing them more often. If you're in a zone where you frequently want to gather nodes, then Haste should be your go-to. This will give you on-demand quickness as well as swiftness and fury, and it's also an excellent skill to use whenever you're engaging in combat. If you don't have the need for out-of-combat quickness, then Mercy will allow you to reset your mark ability, which will come in handy against veteran mobs and above. Our next utility is all about movement. Shadow Step will allow you to skip great distances without needing an enemy and can double as a stun break in combat. If you feel like you could use some more AoE damage instead, then you want to go with Shadow Flare, which will still allow you to teleport afterwards. And if you don't need either of those, then Infiltrator Signet will grant you some extra initiative regen and it'll still let you teleport to your target on a very short cooldown. Our third utility slot is the one we want to use to round out our build. You could add more stealth to your build if you want to avoid combat altogether, or if you could do with another way of triggering an ambush attack. You could also choose to add extra crowd control if you're often facing enemies with a Defiance bar, or even another Signet if you want more ways of cleansing conditions of yourself. And if you need none of those, then Assassin Signet will grant you some extra power to kill enemies faster. That brings us to our elite skill. When mindlessly farming, I would highly recommend Dagger Storm, as it's one of your most potent AoE tools. And with Payback reducing cooldowns by 20% every time your marked target dies, you'll be able to get a lot of use out of this ability. If you're fighting champions or tougher enemies in general, then Thieves Guild will add extra damage, crowd control, and 3 extra bodies to tank the damage for you. When it comes to gear, anything with power on it works. If you freshly boosted the Thief, then Celestial gear will hold you over just fine until you can get a Berserker set, which you'll eventually want if you're taking your Thief to group content as well. If you're exclusively playing in the open world, then Marauder's gear will be a great option for some extra HP. If you're going for the Berserker set, by the way, make sure you slot in Runes of the Scholar or Dragon Hunter, whichever is cheapest, as this will enable you to play any power-based build in strikes, raids and fractals as well. Our weapons are of course gonna be dual pistols, and we'll want to use Sigils of Force and Impact for the increase to our overall damage. And equipping a shortbow with Sigils of Draining and Energy in your second set will allow you to effortlessly tag events and join meta trains. And as for the relic, you'll want a Relic of Speed most of the time. This will increase your movement speed considerably, both in and out of combat. The basic gameplay loop of the build is really simple. Mark an enemy, use your pistol tree skill, which is called Unload, which will usually kill them, and mark your next target to repeat the cycle all over again. There is one option you'll want to enable for this build in the settings, and most of the other builds in the game benefit from this as well, and that's allow skill retargeting in the combat and movement sections of the general settings tab. This will allow you to change your target even when you're mid-unload, and it'll cause the remainder of your bullets to hit your new target. This way you can change targets if your first happens to die halfway through your unload animation without wasting the remainder of the damage. And that's basically it. This build should allow you to hit the gold per hour numbers in any of my mob farming guides, and it's well worth having for the open world. If you have any other comments or questions, feel free to ask them down below or join my Discord, and a quick like and subscribe would really help me out.